On March 10, 1985, General Secretary Konstantin Chernenko of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union was pronounced dead in Moscow. This followed the deaths of 2 other general secretaries within 3 years, highlighting the steadily advancing age and declining health of many top party officials. Worse, for decades the Union had stagnated under conservative leadership, with corruption and nepotism allowed to run amok, especially in the economies of the various Soviet socialist republics, and a military expenditure of over 40% of the Soviet annual budget that prevented the Union from meeting the needs of its citizens, as the USSR waged an unproductive war in Afghanistan and killed thousands of its soldiers. However, the fact that much of the old guard of the Communist Party was, well, so old, gave many hope that a new generation of reformers, already coalescing at the lower levels of the party, would sweep away the ossified bureaucracy of the status quo and usher in a new era of stability, growth, and perhaps even democracy. Instead, the Soviet Union got Grigory Romanov. Grigory Romanov's informative days were during the Second World War, when he served with distinction in the brutal siege of Leningrad, perhaps explaining his comparatively hardline stances in contrast to other members. During his time as the party boss of Leningrad, from 1970 to 1983, Romanov secured investments for the city's heavy industry development and successfully built the numerous residential areas to house Leningrad's growing population, as well as significantly expanded the Leningrad metro. Under General Secretary Yuri Andropov, Romanov would become responsible for overseeing the Soviet Union's defense industry. By the time of Chernenko's death in 1985, Romanov had built a reputation for himself as a party hardliner and as a champion of the Soviet Union's military-industrial complex. Thanks to a combination of his chief rival, Mikhail Gorbachev, being away from Moscow at the time of Chernenko's death, and support from other Communist Party hardliners, most notably Viktor Grishin, Romanov was able to easily secure power in the Soviet Union, becoming the next General Secretary of the Communist Party on March 11. Gorbachev himself, as well as other reform-minded Politburo members, quickly found themselves sidelined by Romanov as he consolidated power, and by August, Gorbachev was demoted out of the Politburo. With no opposition remaining, Romanov set about his goal of preserving the Union from reform, in full confidence that the Soviet Union would weather anything thrown at it as it had before. The first priority of the Romanov administration upon coming to power was the conduction of the Soviet war in Afghanistan. In December of 1979, after years of instability in Afghanistan, Red Army soldiers overthrew the revolutionary Afghan government to establish one more closely under Soviet supervision under the leadership of Babarak Karmal. The situation soon deteriorated, and anti-communist rebel groups rose up across the country to oppose the Karmal government and the Soviet occupation. Throughout the early 1980s, the Soviet government maintained the line that the Red Army was in Afghanistan purely for humanitarian reasons and was not involved in combat, even as soldiers returned home wounded with accounts of fighting Afghan rebels. As a result, the Soviet government was soon forced to censor coverage of the war in Afghanistan. Despite increasing numbers of the Red Army soldiers pouring into Afghanistan, when Romanov came to power, the war had devolved into a stalemate. Romanov, rather than changing course, continued the previous government's policy of censoring coverage of the war in the Soviet Union while sending ever more soldiers to fight the Mujahideen. In 1987, Red Army soldiers under the command of General Mikhail Zaitsev undertook an offensive to capture the Mujahideen stronghold of Bamyan. While the offensive itself succeeded in capturing the city, Mujahideen forces were able to retreat and inflict significant casualties, ultimately negating the success of the Bamyan campaign. Further offensives launched to capture all border regions of Afghanistan were met with similar results. The failure to bring the war to an end and the increasing rise in casualties made it all but impossible by the late 1980s for the Soviet government to continue hiding the invasion from the public, and throughout the mid to late 1980s people began to protest in the war. Anti-militarism became a uniting force in many of the non-Russian republics of the Union, especially in the Baltic and Central Asia regions, where anti-Soviet protests that would soon escalate into riots became commonplace by the end of the decade. Draft dodging and protesting the draft soon became just as widespread. Equally widespread was the usage of the Red Army to crack down on this increasing unrest. Romanov and his government refused to budge an inch, and in June of 1986, Romanov demanded that the Red Army use any means necessary to crush anti-Soviet activity. Hundreds of protesters were killed throughout the 80s and early 90s, thousands injured, and many thousands more were incarcerated by Soviet authorities. Despite the iron-fisted approach to the ascent, however, it only continued to rise. Making matters worse for Romanov's administration was the Chernobyl nuclear disaster. Sometime in late April of 1986, an accident occurred at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant that caused a full reactor meltdown, releasing deadly levels of radiation that reached as far as Western Europe. Romanov, upon hearing of the disaster, chose to keep it classified, prioritizing the prevention of any information from leaving the area as opposed to effectively cleaning up the aftermath of the accident. Life continued on in toxic areas to human life in Ukraine and Belarus for decades, even as cancer and birth defects ravaged populations and Western nations demanded that the Soviet Union address what was quickly becoming the largest health crisis in the world at the time. It would not be fully known what had occurred at Chernobyl until 2010, by which point untold thousands had died or been maimed from radiation poisoning. While the endless war in Afghanistan continued and the Politburo continued to cover up deadly disasters within their borders, the economy of the Soviet Union worsened. By the 1970s, the Soviet Union had become a net importer of grain and increasingly relied on oil exports to buy the grain necessary to feed its growing population. While this strategy initially worked, in 1995 Saudi Arabia suddenly lowered its own oil prices, flooding the global market with cheap oil and undercutting Soviets' profits. Unwilling to reduce the military budget, cut support to Eastern Bloc allies, or introduce rationing to the Soviet populace, Romanov and his Politburo were instead forced to turn to borrowing money to make up the roughly $20 billion deficit needed to keep importing food. By the beginning of the 1990s, the Soviet Union had become a ticking time bomb, and the only man who could do a thing about it stuck his head in the sand and pretended nothing was wrong. And then, on January 17th, 1992, the crisis of the 90s began. On New Year's Day of 1992, Romanov ordered his government to take out more loans to keep the Union afloat. By this point, the Union was running a colossal deficit and taking out more and more loans to keep its economy afloat. Fewer and fewer banks were willing to lend to them, and the Union found itself having to maintain the same levels of spending with less available revenue every passing year. This time, no bank was willing to lend. For the first 17 days of January, Romanov forced the government to maintain silence. So long as the Politburo refused to admit the dire financial straits the Union was in, there remained time to find a new loaner. But no new loans were forthcoming. Worse, Western sources had caught a whiff of rumors from many of the banks the Politburo had approached. News of the crisis in the Soviet Union was circulating rapidly throughout the rest of the world. Despite attempts to restrict the spread of information, more and more panicked Soviet citizens began attempting to buy whatever supplies they could to prepare. On January 12th, the Red Army was stationed outside various stores to prevent looting with orders to arrest anyone slandering the Union. This had the opposite of its intended effect, and citizens flooded into the stores to buy whatever they could. By January 17th, the situation was completely out of control, and some Red Army units even seemed close to mutiny. Unable to do anything else, Romanov gave an address to the people of the USSR the next day, attempting to downplay the situation while admitting to some extent that the economy of the Union had entered its death throes. The next few months were pandemonium across the Union. In an attempt to keep the people placated, rationing was introduced, which led to food riots breaking out throughout the first months of 1992. These, combined with the anti-war protests in many of the non-Russian SSRs, were met with brutal crackdowns. Many protesters were killed by the Red Army during the first 6 months of 1992, quickly eclipsing the death toll from the earlier protests during the 80s. Worse, with the collapse of the Soviet economy came a general economic collapse across the Eastern Bloc. Riots engulfed East Berlin, Prague, Bratislava, Bucharest, Budapest, and Warsaw, as local police and armed forces coupled with Red Army detachments struggled to maintain order. The ripples of the collapse of the Soviet economy reached as far as Yugoslavia. For decades, the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia had relied on being a neutral party in the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union to obtain favorable diplomatic and economic deals with both sides. With the Soviet Union's economy in freefall, Yugoslavia suddenly lost its advantageous position in the eyes of the West. The Soviet Union was unable to give out loans, and the West was unwilling. Unreally engulfed in turmoil, Yugoslavia found its own economy collapsing alongside the rest of the European communist world. After the first half of 1992, protests and riots began to die down across the Union, if for no other reason than so many protesters had already been killed and the rest cowered into submission. Rationing was maintained throughout 1992 and into 1993, as Romanov refused to implement the necessary economic reforms that so many were calling for by this point. The Red Army still received by far the most resources that the Union still had to offer, and the defense industry was bolstered rather than dismantled. Romanov believed that it would be then, when the Union was in its deepest crisis, that the West would invade the Soviet Union, and thus all preparations for the defense of the country had to be made. Content to lay back and watch the Union crumble, no serious plans for an offensive were drawn up by NATO, but Romanov refused to be swayed by his advisors. Rather than winding down the war in Afghanistan, Romanov continued sending even more soldiers into the meat grinder. Casualties mounted for little to no gain as the war persisted, with seemingly no end in sight. While protests died down, some did still take place, and increasingly, veterans of the Afghan war took the lead of the anti-war movement. So-called Afghanцы became leaders of various counter-cultural movements across the Soviet Union, advocating for more autonomy from Moscow for their SSRs, an ending to rationing and increased political rights. Some even called for full independence. And so, while events on the ground turned increasingly radical, the Communist Party itself also underwent changes. Much of the old guard that had governed the Union for so long were dying of old age. By 1993, most of them were dead or retired, leaving Romanov and his hardliners increasingly isolated. In their place came much stronger, more ambitious, reform-minded individuals who sought to rectify the flaws of the Soviet Union. Most notable of these was Nikolai Rykov, a former ally of Gorbachev and a staunch reformist. While enough of the Politburo remained hardliners, especially one Gennady Zyuganov, Rykov faction would continue to gain influence. This was the Soviet Union situation when, in April of 1993, Yugoslavia imploded into civil war. Already racked by economic crisis and ethnic tensions, the question of which nation would hold the presidency could not be resolved for 2 years, as Croatia and Serbia argued between themselves for the right, each controlling 4 votes in the Yugoslav Council, and neither backing down. In 1993, Bosnia finally agreed to Serbia obtaining the presidency, making Alexander Mitrovic the Prime Minister of Yugoslavia, though in reality it was Slobodan Milosevic that called the shots in Belgrade. As a result, Slovenia, Croatia and Macedonia all declared independence, and the Yugoslav People's Army began to move against Croatia. On April 11th, Croatian and Yugoslav forces met at the Battle of Vukovar, officially beginning the Yugoslav Wars. To many, the Yugoslav Wars were a sad reminder of days thought to be long over in Europe. To Romanov and his hardliners, the crisis seemed a miracle, especially when NATO began backing Slovenia and Croatia militarily. Even while the Soviet Union was beaten down, it had an opportunity to prove itself a superpower still, and gain a new ally against NATO that it had lost so many decades ago. Despite the protests of Rykov and his allies, the Politburo voted in favor of sending military equipment and advisors to Yugoslavia to help in against the NATO-backed secessionists. Millions of rubles worth of guns, ammunition, artillery, and even older tank models flooded into Yugoslavia, aiding them significantly. By the end of the first month of the war, while Slovenia and Macedonia had been allowed their independence, Croatia was on the back foot against the Serbs, seized all ethnic Serbian territory within Croatia. While initially it seemed that Yugoslavia would soon be reunited, their government had other plans. Milosevic had no real interest in keeping Croatian on Yugoslavia, instead only demanding ethnically Serbian territory be handed over to Yugoslavia. This demand could not be met by the nationalist Croatian government, and throughout 1993 and 1994, the conflict settled into a stalemate. Croatian soldiers attempted numerous counter-offensive against the entrenched Serbs, while an increasingly desperate Romanov pressured Serbia to win the war. The Soviet heavy industry could not keep up with maintaining both the Red Army in Afghanistan, across the Union and the Eastern Bloc, and supplying the Yugoslavs at the same time. Croatian soldiers attempted numerous counter-offensive against the entrenched Serbs, while an increasingly desperate Romanov pressured Serbia to win the war. Soviet heavy industry could not keep up with maintaining both the Red Army in Afghanistan, across the Union and the Eastern Bloc, and supplying the Yugoslavs at the same time, especially not in their economically crippled state. Worse, while the war against Croatia raged, Bosniak insurgents rose up against Yugoslavia, further stretching Serbian capabilities and increasing the demand for Red Army equipment. Rationing continued into 1994, as did the protests against it. A new wave of anti-Soviet demonstrations rocked the Eastern Bloc in March of that year, and only a strong Red Army presence kept order across the Warsaw Pact nations. Despite the Red Army occupations, protests continued, if not quite as strong, and no less determined to see their countries leave the Eastern Bloc. The situation was much the same in the Baltic SSRs, where Lithuanian, Latvian, and Estonian activists had all taken out the cry for independence. The economic situation only worsened as Romanov refused to cut spending towards the Red Army despite desperate pleas to the contrary from Rykov, and the war in Afghanistan was going absolutely nowhere as casualties mounted. Romanov continued burying his head in the sand, even as inevitable collapse continued to loom, ever worse than before. By 1995, the crisis of the 1990s had reached a fever pitch in the Union. Protests were growing again, the economy continued its nosedive, and lengthy wars and a massive military drained what little resources the Soviet Union could actually muster. Rations were shrinking month to month, and people were tired of going hungry. On July 6, 1995, the largest wave of protests in Soviet history rocked the country. Moscow, Leningrad, Minsk, Alma-Ata, Riga, Vilnius, all were swept up in the chaos as the demonstrators rioted through the streets, smashing windows and stealing whatever food they could. The protests were even worse across the Eastern Bloc, and by the end of the week, the Red Army found itself being forced to retreat and regroup outside of major cities as they fell to anarchy across the Warsaw Pact. Surrounded by a wall of Red Army soldiers and tanks, the Politburo was in crisis. Romanov had finally realized that the course he charted would lead only to disaster. And yet, he refused to budge. Unfortunately for him, the entire rest of the Politburo, was against him. Led by Rykov, the Politburo passed a resolution demanding significant economic reform to end the crisis. Most notably, the budget of the Red Army was to be slashed, and the focus on heavy industry that had been the bedrock of Soviet economy since the days of Stalin was to be shifted towards light industry instead. With no other choice, Romanov accepted the resolution and announced it to the cheering crowds on radio and television 2 days later. Finally, Romanov realized his days of total power over the Union had come to an end. With the slashing of the Red Army's budget, a massive withdrawal of Soviet forces into the Union itself followed. Unable to maintain the war in Afghanistan, Red Army forces began a hasty retreat, fully exiting the country by the beginning of 1996 as Mujahideen forces advanced against the unprepared Afghan government. Without resupply from the Soviet Union, Yugoslavia's war effort against Croatia began to falter and collapse as between 1996 and 1998 the Croatians advanced with NATO aid against increasingly undersupplied Serbians. Bosniak rebels seized more territory at the same time, only worsening the situation. By 1998, Serbia was forced out of Croatia entirely, and Milosevic's government agreed to allow Croatia to become an independent state. Unable to secure the Eastern Bloc, the Red Army withdrew entirely, leaving their positions by the 1st of January 1996. The very next day, the Polish government collapsed, and a new Polish Republic was established. Hungary followed swiftly on Poland's heels, then Czechoslovakia, and in February, East Germany's government fell. A group of Romanian generals and liberal activists rose up against the brutal Ceausescu regime on February the 17th. And after repeated demands for Soviet assistance went unanswered, Romania withdrew from the Warsaw Pact. By the end of February, only Bulgaria remained a Warsaw Pact member, and even that was hard-pressed to put down its own protesters and maintain the order of the socialist regime. By the time the Red Army had fully withdrawn into the borders of the Soviet Union, it was too late to crush the protests. Calls for independence rang in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Georgia, Ukraine. And with the Red Army's budget slashed, many of its former soldiers left to join the protests. All hope seemed lost for the Union at the beginning of 1996, and a near total collapse of the Eastern Bloc only made the Soviet Union's collapse seem more inevitable. However, thanks to the swift implementation of the economic shifts Rykov proposed, throughout the beginning months of 1996, rations slowly began to increase as the Union found itself able to import food again. Starvation would ultimately be averted, and as more food became available, the protests of 1995 began to die down once again, at least in Russia and Belarus and much of Central Asia. Red Army crackdowns were still utilized against the demonstrators, but injury and detention became the norm instead of killing, as the Red Army shifted tactics. In the Ukrainian SSR, the Red Army continued to use violence to keep order throughout 1996. But in the rest of the republics, it either became unnecessary or the Red Army had entirely lost control, as was the case in all three of the Baltic republics. By the end of 1996, the Soviet position in the Baltic republics had become completely untenable. The Red Army was unable to maintain control and withdrew into their military bases to wait for reinforcements. General Secretary Romanov refused to let any part of the Union go, planning a secret military operation with Dmitry Ryazov, the Soviet defense minister, to crush the independence movements of the Baltics and keep the nation together. The plan was discovered in February of 1997 by Rykov, who by this point was considering amputating the Baltic SSRs to keep the rest of the Union stable. Throughout February, March, and April, the Politburo debated the issue, while the Red Army's control ebbed. Finally, on the 2nd of May, Lithuania declared independence from the Soviet Union, and 2 days later was followed by Estonia and Latvia. Romanov and his hardliners finally conceded that the Baltics were a lost cause, and Rykov led the Politburo in drafting a new treaty with the independent Baltic states. They would be allowed to maintain their independence on the condition that they remained permanently demilitarized, neutral, and allowed the Red Army to maintain its own military bases on their soil. Unable to resist the case of another Soviet invasion, the three Baltic states agreed to the proposal, and in July, the Leningrad Protocol was put into force, guaranteeing the independence of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. With the Baltic states gone, stabilizing the rest of the Union actually became easier. Throughout 1997, remaining independence protests in Ukraine and Georgia were crushed by what remained of the Red Army, as economic reforms were implemented, rationing lessened until finally in October it was ended entirely, much to the joy of the average Soviet citizen. Romanov maintained his position as General Secretary throughout this time, officially leading the reform efforts, though by this point he had become little more than a rubber stamp for the Politburo, firmly held by Rykov and his allies. By 1998, the Union had settled into a new equilibrium. The economy of the Union, while nowhere near its pre-1992 heights, was slowly on demand, and protests against Soviet policies had all but burned themselves out. The former Warsaw Pact members sought to build their own nations, though all feared the return of Soviet tanks that they believed could strike at any moment. In Romania, although the liberals had won initial victories against Ceausescu's loyalists, the Battle of Bucharest in 1997 had proven a triumphant victory for communist forces, and after another year of fighting, remaining liberal revolutionaries fled or surrendered, ending the Romanian Civil War. Romanov's last major attempt at his own policy with any real chance of success was a rapprochement with Romania, which was firmly rejected in favor of total diplomatic isolation on behalf of the Romanian government. Thus, Bulgaria, a slowly collapsing Yugoslavia, a half-starved North Korea, and an isolated Cuba halfway across the globe remained the Soviet Union's last allies. The 13th five-year plan, to which Rykov's economic reform package was bundled into, proved to be a badly needed lifeline for the Union. military production was exchanged for production of civilian goods, to the horror of an aging hardliner political class. The Romanovs and remaining allies found themselves completely unable to resist. In 1999, Rykov decided to use the model of the Baltic states as a starting point for renewed relations with the former Eastern Bloc. After a year of negotiations, the former Eastern Bloc states of Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and East Germany, all of whom were headed by liberal democratic administrations, agreed to permanent neutrality in exchange for a guarantee of independence from the Soviet Union. East Germany also had to agree that it would never reunite with West Germany, ending negotiations between the two sides that had been ongoing. The Treaty of Budapest, signed in 2000, further repealed trade relations between these states as independent nations, rather than satellites of Moscow. On December 1st, year 2000, President Bill Clinton and an American delegation met Rykov and his own delegation in Geneva, Switzerland, to celebrate New Year's together. Shaking hands, both leaders declared an official end to the Cold War, and jubilation swept the globe as a new era of peace seemed to dawn on the world. Despite the official end to the Cold War being declared, the conflict continued into the new millennium. In Afghanistan, the socialist Afghan government continued to hold out against the Mujahideen, though by the 2000s it was clear that they had no real hope of winning. In 2001, tensions between the Macedonians wishing to unite with socialist Bulgaria and those wishing to remain independent boiled over into a brief civil war, ending quickly in a NATO-aligned victory. Yugoslavia continued to fight Bosniak insurgents, and increasingly, Yugoslav forces enacted genocidal retribution for the actions of the insurgents, much to the outrage of the international community. Even Rykov refused to fully back the Serbs' forces after that, wanting to maintain a better international standing, though Romanov demanded that the USSR aid Yugoslavia against the West. In 2003, Soviet and American diplomats met in secret to agree to a limited NATO intervention to halt the genocide in Bosnia. In 2 weeks, years of Yugoslav progress had been undone, as NATO forces cooperated with Bosniak rebels to occupy most of the ethnically Bosnian territory. Unable to maintain control, Milosevic agreed to grant Bosnia independence while keeping majority Serb territories, ending hostilities for the most part. While the terrorist campaign by the Kosovo Liberation Army continues to this day, the matter has largely remained an internal Yugoslav affair. By the 2000s, Romanov had lost all control over the Politburo, who now answered to Rykov. The Soviet economy was growing once again, and quality of life was improving across the Soviet Union, though human rights abuses remained relatively commonplace. Rykov successfully lowered tensions between NATO and the Warsaw Pact while maintaining its old allegiances, beginning the process of Soviet modernization. Relations with China were also improved, and by the mid-2000s, China became the Soviet Union's largest trading partner by far. Things seemed to be looking up for the Union. This upward swing for the Soviets caused alarm in Poland especially, who wanted more than a guarantee of independence from the Soviet Union. Thus, secret negotiations between Warsaw and Washington were opened, and in 2005, Poland formally joined NATO, much to the chagrin of the Politburo. Romanov, in particular, was livid and demanded a nuclear response to Poland joining NATO. While Rykov was disappointed, he was swiftly able to talk down Romanov and instead opened negotiations with Washington over the matter. At the same time Poland joined NATO, Yugoslavia also saw protection from further NATO encroachment. In 2004, NATO expanded to allow Slovenia and Croatia into NATO, and Milosevic feared that Yugoslavia would once again be invaded by the alliance and made overtures to Moscow to bring Yugoslavia into the Warsaw Pact. Negotiations between American President Al Gore and the Soviet Politburo led by Rykov allowed for Poland to join NATO on the condition that Yugoslavia would join the Warsaw Pact, and neither alliance could expand any further into the remainder of the former Eastern Bloc. Crisis had been averted, but relations would cool between Washington and Moscow once again as a result of the Polish crisis. Tensions between the capitalist West and socialist East would remain a fixture of the European continent for the foreseeable future. And finally, having lost all real power. By 2008, Romanov was a shell of his former self. Plagued by health issues and increasingly bitter against the Politburo, Romanov watched as the vision he had of a strong Soviet Union came to pass, under different leadership and a different ideal than his own. He had failed to save the Union, and his rivals had succeeded. A final slay came at the end of 2007, when the Western capitalist economies crashed as a result of massive financial mismanagement. It had been under Rykov that the Soviet Union lived to see the West finally tumble from its position of preeminence, as East Germany, desperate to save its collapsing economy, broke the Treaty of Budapest to sign an agreement to reunite with the West. Romanov passed away on June 3, 2008. With the death of the final old hardliner, a new generation of reformers that had waited so long underneath his shadow finally stepped out into the dawn of a new day for the Soviet Union.